Well, that's the definition of insanity, right? Is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And that's what many folks in the arts have been doing for the last 20 or 30 years.
Hi, Jeffrey. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing good, thanks. Okay, diving right in, this notion of status quo, and that I often hear arts leaders say, well, we've always done it this way. And I thought that the pandemic could have been the opportunity to really shake the bedrock of our sector to say, oh, okay, now we can actually change and we need to change. But yet, I'm seeing, or I saw a lot of people falling back to status quo and this scarcity mindset, right? And survival mode. How can we best prepare the next leaders in the arts to take a fresh approach, to kind of push back against this notion of we've always done it this way, so this is
Mhm.
how we should continue to move forward?
Yeah, and I'm reminded of somebody like Warren Buffett or somebody like that who said, that's the deadliest phrase for any organization is we've always done it that way.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I start again with kind of taking a kind of a STEM approach to the question to say, okay, let's start with data, right? Let's say what the numbers show us. And we can see because the NEA has, at least until now, tracked attendance data in all of the arts. We can look at that information and we can see audiences declining over the last 30 years. We can see funding for the arts decreasing over the last 30 years. So the notion that any administrator would say, well, it's too risky to risk changing or trying something new. Well, that's the definition of insanity, right? Is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And that's what many folks in the arts have been doing for the last 20 or 30 years. And so, I mean, what stronger argument do we need that there is a need for some new approaches? I do think that again, the younger generation is much more open to that idea because they are more aware of the realities as we were talking about a minute ago. And so they do see the need to try new things. They're just always not sure how to go about developing those ideas and evaluating them and implementing them. And then, of course, that's where I come in and say, okay, well, let's talk about the entrepreneurial process. I feel like my role is really about empowering our students to, first of all, see that their perspective matters and that their creativity can be brought to bear on these things, and that there is an imperative that they do that because the existing models continue to struggle, and they will continue to struggle until we come up with some new ones.
Yeah, and so I'm reminded that you are a McDowell Fellow and a professor. So you are very used to marrying art and thought leadership together in your career and in your day to day life. How can we help emerging arts administrators, arts entrepreneurs in looking at the possibility of becoming a thought leader, whether it's in civic leadership or getting into roles where we're not talking about we need a seat at the table, but we're actually taking a seat at the table and then applying what we know that we get from the arts to problem solving in every community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that part of the answer, anyway, is for the would-be administrator or entrepreneur to not ever see that as being separate from their artistic practice. And that's certainly something that I'm very passionate about. I'm still active as a composer. I view my work as a composer as being absolutely hand in glove with my work as an entrepreneur and as an advocate, because it's all in service to the art. But to recognize that if the way they are advocating, the way they are promoting their organization, the way they are thinking about their programming, if they start with the art and the audience that they're trying to connect with, and they look about how to make that connection the most vibrant connection that they can make, most of the rest of it will more or less, I won't say it'll fall into place, but it will emerge, the path will emerge about how to go about the rest of it. But so often we disconnect those two things and we make assumptions about what audiences want or what they will tolerate or what they're looking for. And we don't challenge those assumptions, and we make programming decisions and institutional strategy decisions based on those assumptions. And it's no surprise that then things sometimes go off the rails.
You're making me think about, and I don't know if you can think of an example, but when we think about traditional arts, classical music, theater, fine arts, anything that we have, it's evolved over time, right? So now when we have organizations worrying about aging audiences or not being able to engage younger audiences, are there examples that you can look at to say how we as a sector today should be adapting to be more relevant to the current potential audience member?
I mean, there certainly are. Unfortunately, most of the examples that I can think of are negative examples.
Hmm.
One of my favorite stories, and I won't name the orchestra, but a friend of mine is a principal in a major orchestra. We'll just put it that way. And he posted something on social media, and he said, "Hi everybody, I need a little crowdsourcing here for me. I've been put on my orchestra's diversity committee. I'm not really quite sure why. Maybe it's because I'm a gay guy. Otherwise, I'm just a white guy, right? But I'm on the diversity committee, and we've been tasked with trying to come up with some programming that will reach underserved and minority and marginalized communities in our city. And I don't even know where to start. Oh, I would love to hear your ideas." And I thought, oh boy, I'm gonna pop some popcorn here and I'm just gonna watch the comments, right? And so for several days, 125 comments or so, and people say, well, you should try this, you should try this, you should try this, you should try this. And I'm thinking to myself, well, some of these might be great ideas, but they have skipped over the most essential thing. And finally, when I couldn't stand it anymore, I commented. I said, well, if you want to reach marginalized communities, why don't you talk to them about what they want?
100%.
Right? And it just shut the whole conversation down because I was just like, I don't know if any of these ideas are good. Maybe some of them are brilliant ideas, but
Yeah.
you're skipping the most important step. You've got to figure out what your community wants. And like I was saying, I think instead we make assumptions. Like the classic one is our older audiences, our aging audiences, they don't want anything new, right? They only want the traditional canon, and that's all they will tolerate, and they will walk out and boycott it. There is so much evidence that that's not true, and yet that assumption remains so deeply ingrained, especially in the orchestra world, that it's kind of maddening because, first of all, it's patronizing and condescending to your audience that they're not capable of or open-minded enough to experience something new. And we have
Right.
all this evidence that shows that they're open to it.
Well, sometimes I wonder how much is it that we don't ask because we don't want the answer that we're going to get?
Well, I think that's true for sure. Change is hard, right? I mean, institutions get ingrained, they get established in their way of doing things, and it's very difficult to change them. And I will acknowledge that. And I think that there are some reasons beyond just worldview why arts organizations have a difficult time changing. And one of them is our funding structure.
Mm-hmm.
So there are plenty of foundations out there that may give you a grant to try for a year, a community outreach program or something like that. Or maybe it's a 2-year grant. That's really, now we're really getting and the heart is in the right place, right? We want to support these arts institutions coming up with new and innovative ways to reach their community. And they might, in fact, come up with some new and interesting ways. But then the funding gets cut off. Or you spend those 2 years really figuring out what's going to work. I mean, the entrepreneurial process is all about iteration, right? It's always about evaluating your first go and then trying to have a 2.0, version 2.0 and version 3.0. And sometimes it takes some of that iteration before you find the right thing. And unless funders are willing to give organizations a longer runway, and then once they find the thing that works, that clicks in the community, to continue to support that, then what are you supposed to do? If you're an arts administrator, you're going to be like, well, I don't know that I want to go through all this thing just to know that in a year the plug's going to get pulled anyway.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. And I've said for a long time that we need to revolutionize how we view and invest in the arts. And the model maybe worked 30, 40 years ago, but really the model has not changed in all that time. And so I think that a lot of times funders, or actually sometimes I will refer to them as funnelers, because they're really the funneling the funding that a public entity is allocating to them. And so the funnelers have the challenge of proving to the funder why or what the return on art will be by giving us this money. And so forever, we have been measuring outputs, not outcomes. We're measuring how many tickets, how many artists, how many programs. And I think that's been this cycle of we'll fund it for a year or two, but then we've got to go to the next because we've got to go back to the funder and say, look at all these people that we're serving. And what I'm thinking is we need to say not how many as much as what happens to the many that participate. And that gets into that data that you talk about too.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I mean, every time I write a grant as a composer for just some of my own work, one of the questions is almost always, how will you measure the success of this project? And I'm like, well, I'll write the piece and they'll play it. I don't know what else to say, right? And so,
I know.
and so we have to say, well, we'll track ticket sales and we'll do an audience survey at the end, and but it's just it goes back to what we were saying before, that the arts, it's harder to get your hands around impact.
Right.
And the idea, the argument that, well, the arts enriches
Yeah.
culture in our society,
Right.
that becomes so sort of diffuse and abstract that a lot of people are just like, well, I don't know, show me the numbers.
Exactly. So I don't know if you knew that we've been working on building the last year a metric tool that actually can show the numbers. So we're measuring impact, empathy, critical thinking, creativity, like other industries assess outcomes. So for example, hospitals used to measure impact on how many surgeries they performed in a year. That's like measuring how many people attended to the concert. Hospitals now measure how many surgeries were successful. And so we are looking at how is our programming creating a more empathetic community, community that has lower anxiety levels, better mental well-being, more connection, job transferable skills. So we're looking at the 21st century skills, the 4 C's: communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. And we're taking that, we're now measuring those, and we're turning that into the return on art. So it goes right to the heart of everything that you're saying is we've got to have the language that other industries use if we want to get that investment. And we have to come out of the box and say that we should be looking across industries for collaboration and support, not just this one little area. That again, that gets into that scarcity mindset. It also gets into change is hard. We've always done it this way. There's so many layers upon layers on that we've got to break out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I constantly try to do in my own creative work, but which I'm also preaching to students all the time, is that partnerships are one of the most valuable and most underutilized methods to build support for your project and build an audience for it. I was just in Nebraska this past weekend for a performance of a string quartet that I've written that's about deforestation. And one of the things that we've always done every time the quartet has been played is we partner with local environmental groups and we get them to come to the show. We get them to talk to the audience afterwards. We have resources to say, how can you get involved in your community? And not only does that bring something more to the audience than just a musical performance, and hopefully it gives something that they take home with them and think about, but also it helps you build an audience, because those environmental organizations that you're partnering with, they have mailing lists too. There's a very simple way to simply broaden the reach of this thing, sort of the opposite of the scarcity. It grows the pie. This weekend in Nebraska, they had the State Forest Service came and they actually had little seedlings of trees and we raffled them off after the show. Like, it was brilliant, right?
I love that.
And there's so many ways to do those kinds of things, reaching out across communities. And you just have to be willing to try it. And I probably spend more of my energy on simply convincing presenters that if you do something like this, it will be a success. And everyone's just so afraid of risk. And especially these days now, we're doubly afraid, right? Well, if I do anything that's too woke or too progressive or whatever, I might lose all my funding. When I think that, unfortunately, that this is happening because we're just starting to realize, I think, the power of these kinds of partnerships. You're starting to see them more and more often. And I think it's just a critical way. People say the arts aren't relevant or the arts don't have something to say to me right now in 2025. And it's like, well, let's talk about deforestation. right? Let's talk about how that affects all of us.
So when you're talking about those myths or those, the art stereotypical, we're not relevant, you're over there, we've got more important things. And then you come up with deforestation. Deforestation? Did I say it
Yes.
correctly? Okay. Where does that come from? I mean, how did,
How did I
so
come up with
yeah,
that?
tell me how, where, okay, pun intended, when was the seed planted? How did that come about?
Mhm.
Explain that.
The arts don't live in a vacuum. They relate to other disciplines around them. I studied geology, and I'm thinking, how could my love of the earth and of nature inform my creative work? And the real breakthrough on that point was when I wrote a geologic symphony back in 2013 about the geology of the Rocky Mountains, and commissioned, again, talking about partnerships, commissioned by the Geological Society of America, which is based here in Boulder, Colorado. And they were celebrating a big anniversary. So they were looking for something cool to do. Right? And that was when I really realized that this power of connecting with community organizations and creating these partnerships. So the quartet about deforestation was really, it was just sort of the next logical thing. So I said, what can I do to connect that dot for somebody to leave the concert hall and be thinking, now I'm going to think about what can I do in my own forest community? What can I do to speak out about deforestation? Now I understand a little bit more about how deforestation contributes to climate change and, all these things. Well, we need to, first of all, have some experts to come in, and we need to figure out how to get people to stick around for that part of the program, have a Q&A and a conversation about climate change and forests and what you can do here in your community. And when we have done that without fail, even though me and the players are also up there, they can ask anybody anything. There'll be like one artistic question or 5 questions about the forest. And that tells me that this is something that people are connecting with.
Right, 100%. I love how you've thought on all the aspects and the layers. And so that just goes to show that we can adapt and we can be relevant. We have to think creatively about how we apply the work in community. So how much pushback did you get when you come up, or did you get pushback, or do you have these partners, these environmentalists or partners say, wow, like this is fantastic? Because some might think, oh, it's just too much work. I have the idea, but they're never going to want to collaborate. Did you
Yeah.
come up against that?
The only time there's been pushback has been from the musical presenters
Hmm.
who are afraid because this is something different for their audience. In terms of the community partners, I mean, you call up the local nature conservancy or the Arbor Days Foundation or whatever, they're in. Like, you don't have to convince them at all because their whole mission is to try to reach people and build awareness. So that's never where the pushback is.
Isn't that interesting to think about where the pushback's coming from? Every industry has to adapt and change. Thank you, Jeffrey. I really appreciate your time.
It's been my pleasure.